Well, so far we have discussed some of the basic concepts, and in the last lecture I had given a brief discussion on the meaning of culture and then cultural ecology and cultural ecological theory. And in this lecture we will be looking at what human ecology is, its basic concepts, meanings, and the interrelationship between different kinds of resources in this planet system, and how each one of the component in a sense is affecting the other species. So, in some way the humans, if you take as an entity, whatever we does often leave an imprint, or it does have some kind of implications on the environment. This is something which in a sense the human ecology tries to look at. Now, to begin with, let us try to familiarize ourselves with what human ecology is. Human ecology in a sense is a kind of approach in order to look at or study human behavior, and this can perhaps be divided into two. And the first part looks at how humans should be studied, living systems operating in a complex environment. Now, if you look at in the slides, you would see operating in complex environments. Why is human seen to be or known to be operating in the complex environment? Is because it is different from the plants and animals, and we all know human itself in itself is unpredictable, for the simple reason that human is guided by different emotions, different desires, different needs. Therefore, the way humans operate in this environment is quite complex, and therefore human ecologists tends to deal with this and art the way how humans operate, or tries to make an in-depth study into this. And in a sense, human science also can be divided into several social science disciplines. If you look at in the social sciences, it can be divided into humanistic as well as the human biological disciplines. Now, within this, ecologists attempts to understand how these diverse part of the system operate together in order to produce some kind of behavior, and this behavior is something which is being learned as a part of socialization. It is not something which is pre-given, but it is something which is being learned not just in the environment, but also beginning from the family system. Therefore, it is important to look at this diverse part of system, which in a way environment also affects or have and implications on human behavior. Now, in a sense, in a traditional sense, human science disciplines take or separate people apart, while the human ecologists posits or attempts to put us back together. Now, that is some of the basic difference between a human science and a human ecologist. Now, partly human science tends to separate or segregate depending on our needs, or at the same time based on our expertise, skills, so on and so forth. Whereas human ecology tends to put human together, because it tends to situate human in relationship with the ecosystem, or maybe in terms of our relationship with the biodiversity, for instance. And having said that, secondly, human ecology also deals with how in this similar setting, or if not through this ecology and evolutionary processes, human is also part of the other species. So, in a sense, if I may say so, human ecology tends to posit, if not follow, this approach of biocentric. By biocentric, I mean to say that human is also part of the ecology, if not part of the whole ecosystem. Now, it is also interesting to see that human is not something which has a dominance over others species, but rather they are part and parcel of the whole ecosystem. Now, that is how it is a part of the biocentric approach to the ecosystem. And secondly, if we go by the basic definitions of what human ecology is, where I give a conventional definitions. If you look at the conventional definitions of what human ecology is, it is about the study of how humans interacts with their environments, or in a sense the kind of distributions and abundance of humans, how human in a sense populate, and also it tends to distribute itself based on their needs. Now, over here you can bring in the idea of this carrying capacity. For instance, a human population will definitely tries to inhabit a geographical area wherein it in essence provide enough resources for the needs of those populations. Now, partly if you look at the history of the evolution of society, or how the stages of societies move on, if you look back at the hunting and gathering society, they were in essence being distributed and they were populated depending on the carrying capacity of the resources, or maybe the requirement of animals in order to satisfy their basic needs. Now, society moves on from a more complex, simple to complex, depending on how their basic requirements and needs tends to in essence multiply. Now, that itself also shows the kind of behavioral changes in relations to the environment we are into it. Now, secondly, if you look at the basic definitions, human ecology in essence deals with the relationship between humans and their environment. This is the basic or the rudimentary principles of human ecology. What it tries to espouse and tries to make sense of, relationship can be formed in many ways. As I explained, relationship can be based on fulfilling the basic needs. It can be based on rather fulfilling much more than what you actually required. Now, this is something which we need to look at, how the kind of relationship, relationship can be complex, as I had explained in the context of human, because it is considered to be much more complex compared to other relationship which is being shared by the other species. Now, therefore, if we use this term human ecology, it actually tries to express a broad aspirations to understand human behavior. Now, what is this broad aspiration? It tends to, there are different embedded meanings within this. How these aspirations are being expressed. For instance, in a modern capitalist society, these aspirations could be more in terms of accumulation of wealth, because capitalist society is again being influenced or being guided by the market economy or the market forces. It is nothing but a profit driven ideas. Now, if one is being driven by these profit driven ideas, obviously the kind of behavior or the relationship it share with environment will definitely be different. Now, for instance, those who practice opposite or subscribes to the idea of a capitalist economy, which is of course beginning from the Western society and even in the global South today, we are in a sense being affected as a process of this globalization, modernization process and the market forces. Sort of aspirations keep changing, and many of these aspirations are actually being defined and guided by these forces, that is profit driven desire. Now, we tend to see the environment, if not the resources, as something which will in a sense fulfill our needs or rather greeds. Now, that sort of ideas tends to develop that aspirations or ideas within us to see or posit the resources as something from a very utilitarian perspective. The economic value of resources or the external value rather, we tend to overlook the intrinsic value of those resources, the kind of relationship which normally was being shared in the past generations. Now, we tend to engage in trying to commodify or commodifications of these resources, as if we tend to follow this idea of how the resources cannot be, they are inexhaustible. Now, for instance, for quite some time, water is seen to be something which is out of the context of this resource, but today water is seen to be given more importance, and it is part of the resources, and which in a way can be depleted. Now, this sense of urgency or realization in a sense has come up because there has been an extensive commodifications of even these water resources. Now, we can cite certain examples, and the list can go on. How many of these the corporate companies now, for instance, like the Coke company, for instance, producing this Coca-Cola, and Pepsi, for instance, they have been excessively exploiting or using these fresh drinking water bodies in order to satisfy their sort of market needs. Now, and we also tends to like come across different kind of intertrans boundary water disputes between states within India, for instance, and across different countries and nations. Now, because we in a sense felt the sort of importance of this water resource as which was considered to be like freely given to us, as if it cannot in a sense be exhaustible. Now, these are partly something which we can try to perhaps include or trying to sort of give a critique, questions, debate about the human relationship with their environment across different stages, and then primarily in the present context. And why is this relationship between human and environment is in essence given so much importance today, and why is the need to locate and situate this relationship. And in the upcoming lectures, we will try to address and look at how society maintained or connected with nature or environment in the past. So, these are something which we would be looking at. Now, looking at the background of how this human ecology study in essence emerges, what is the basic need of even talking about human ecology or positioning human ecology in the academic domain. Now, partly if you look at history, human usually engage in different kinds of activities, and that have in a sense directly or indirectly affected or so to say damaged the environment, and some of these implications are seen to be dangerous and permanent in a sense. So, because even there are resources which can be renewable and non-renewable, because when we engage in trying to damage the non-renewable resources, it does leave a permanent scar in the environment. And as a result of this, there's sort of a pose which is being a threat which is being posed to the environment, because if you look at the post-industrial society and with the beginning of colonialism, many countries were being colonized, and India is one of them, where the Britishers were in essence colonizing more than 200 years. Now, the amount or the kind of natures which was being exploited and damaged during this period, that is in the industrial and post-industrial period and the colonial period, the magnitude of how the environment is being damaged or resources were depleted multiplies much more than anything else. And why is this damage on the environment so much felt and so much high? Perhaps one reason could be the increase in the size of population. Now, Malthus might have a different, if you go by the Malthusian theory of these populations, it tends to see the increasing population size as something which also is posing a threat to the environment, because he tends to see in terms of the supply and demand, or maybe if population increases, and definitely it is going to have an impact on the environment, that is in exploiting of much more resources. Therefore, if we go by the Malthusian theory, increase in size of populations is perhaps one of the factors of how the natural system is being affected or reduced, or the carrying capacity is being under threat. Now, perhaps Malthus in a sense also contribute to influencing some of the earlier thinkers who tends to come up with this idea of this human ecology, or the human ecologists rather. Now, when we talk about this increasing human population, for instance, if you take the examples of the present day, for instance, the process of this urbanization. The urbanization has in a sense tends to exploit the resources, or maybe there is much more demand of land, a space which is required for the human settlement. Now, by and by, as a result of this modernization process, people tends to shift more and more from the rural to the urban spaces, and those populations in the urban spaces again is dependent on the hinterland, if not the rural areas, for the supply of food. Now, that rural urban continuum is in a sense have started maybe prior to the colonial period, and then it is much more strengthened. Now, why is this urbanization seen as a problem? Now, for instance, as population increases, crowding, and then many of the cities, especially in the south or maybe in India, are unplanned, and there is an irresponsible sort of dumping of waste items, and as a result of this, it tends to pollute the river water bodies, and as a result of this, it not only poses a threat to the land as such, but also to the water resources. These are some very basic things which in essence we can explain in this context. There are a lot more examples, but this will suffice for us to make sense of how the population increases and also it resulted to reduce the natural ecosystem. Now, secondly, why are these natural systems in a sense, or the ecosystems under threat? Because they are no longer able to kind of process and rid the biosphere of waste which accumulate and are called pollutants. Now, even pollutants can be broadly divided into different, it can be air, water, and mostly as a result of the industrial waste. Now, I'll show you some of the pictures in the later slides, where how as a result of the industrialization process, and there is a lot of toxic items being dumped on the river, and then the river in a sense becomes unfit for human consumption. Now, why is this pollutants in a sense being seen to be a threat to the natural ecosystem? Is because they are a substance which are added to the environment. Particularly, these are because of the results of human activities, and the human activities can vary. Now, dumping of waste in a sense is one of them, and which in a sense indirectly directly lead to the undesirable effect for all living things, and ultimately on the humans themselves, which in a sense is hardly being realized. Now, human in a sense by engaging all this kind of activity involved in adding pollutants of all sorts to the biosphere, that is land, water and air. Now, these activities which humans in essence engage in a very irresponsible manner has a far-reaching impact on the biosphere. Now, for instance, the depletion the ozone layer, which in essence is also something which is very much debated and discussed. Now, what are these factors? What are the different factors which in essence affect the human population growth? Now, there were times where human populations were not really a problem or a threat. Rather, there was a static growth. Now, why is the population of humans multiplied, and what are the factors responsible for that? First and foremost could be the agricultural revolution, and as a result of agricultural revolutions, the food productions in a sense multiply, and as a result of this, it also in a sense through the use of different kinds of technologies, human tends to produce much more food, and there was a surplus of food rather. Now, the second thing is there is an awareness or an increasing knowledge of ideas, and how, for instance, malaria at one point of time was a threat to mankind, and it also resulted to the death of many people. Now, for instance, now since that very diseases which is being caused by that called malaria, as a result of different inventions and the development of medical sciences, it tends to develop some kind of treatment, and so is different other diseases, because the development of these medical sciences enhances or rather led to the cutting down of the mortality rate of humankind, and therefore, that it could be one factor which led to the growth of populations, and obviously the healthcare facilities is much more higher compared to those say 10 years or 50 years before, and accessibility to like the healthcare centers like hospital, dispensaries, so on and so forth, is much more rather available in close proximity than maybe 10 years, 20 years before, because people tends to travel, like kilometers after kilometers, or maybe they don't have accessibility to these health facilities, and it resulted to the death of many. Now, what is this? The advances in medicines and technology not just only simply cut down the mortality rate, but rather also the longevity of human life in a sense is being extended. The lifespan usually has in a sense increased. Now, maybe 70 years or more than 70 in a sense is an expected lifespan of a human life. Now, as a result of these emerging facilities, the development of medical science, technology, knowledge, and the development of this agriculture revolution, all these in essence have catered to the decrease in death rate and also led to the longer lifespan and an increasing birth rate in some areas. Increasing birth rate in a sense, if you look around, for instance, the IVF, even the couples who lose the hope of like conceiving a child through the use of the medical health can in a sense conceive. So, this sort of facilities were unknown to people like maybe a few decades back. Now, as a result of this, there has been an increasing fertility rates, and mostly in the underdeveloped nations. Now, because the underdeveloped nations, primarily I mentioned this because there is there's no checks and balances, and the kind of health facilities which has been discussed in the, like for example, countries like India, maybe there is an imbalance still, because we don't have adequate number of these maybe doctors or medical centers, which in essence can cater to the needs of the people. Now, and also there is no sort of population controlled, and in essence there is an imbalance in the terms of the existing populations and the kind of facilities which is normally being provided by not only the government, but also the resources, the natural resources. Now, what have all these led to, like the increasing the rate of population growth? Now, in essence, there are two types of resources which I had mentioned. One is the renewable resources, and the second is the non-renewable resources. What is these renewable resources? Which can perhaps be replaced, like for example, the food supply, the solar energy, air, water, soil, living things. All these are in a sense renewable, whereas they are non-renewable resources which cannot be replaced in one's lifetime. That, for example, the fossil fuels. Now, for instance, on this picture, you could actually see how there has been changes in terms of not just the use of motor vehicles, or the changes which in a sense resulted to the depletion of resources, and all these are in a sense as a result of the human population growth and the environment. Now, again, these are partly something which is a result of the supply and demand of the market, how people are extensively engaged in extraction of timbers from the forest, that itself in a sense lead to the deforestations, or the amount of deforestation is much more at a faster and higher speed compared to the past, because there is much more of a demand in the market for woods, maybe for furniture, and or maybe as we talk about in the people like populating in the urban spaces in cities, because population grows and not just extraction, but we also tends to be in much more demand of spaces for settlement, and also resulted in consuming more resources, and also we produce more waste, because the more human population, the more human waste is. And if we look around in many of our cities, the kind of waste management or waste treatment is something which we are very much lagging behind. And if you go to any city, the manner in which the municipality corporations, the way they functions, it is as if something not really adequate, and then they are not able to, in a sense, engaging in cleaning up all these waste items. Perhaps the strength and forces is not really much after the demand, because there is a lot of population, and then the waste items multiplies and increases. Now, in this picture, you can also look at how this introduction of railway, in a sense, also contribute to the depletion of resources. Now, going back to the colonial period, why was this railways being introduced in every nook and corner of the country in India? Is simply because it is being used for sort of transporting different kinds of resources, and these resources in a way is raw material which is to be supplied to the industry. Now, as a result of this, the kind of resources which are being exploited is enormous, and it has led to a higher scale and speed compared to before this introduction of railways and other facilities were available. Now, for instance, the paper industry, for example, is in demand of much more of resources like wood. Now, we have increasingly realized that we should use less paper, and then but to in practical, these are something which is still yet to be implicated, because we tend to use a lot of we don't really establish or being aware of the kind of interconnections which we, in a sense, have an implications on the environment rather. So, this is something which we need to not just only discuss in academia, but also this environmental awareness needs to be developed even in the right from the high schools. And in the last few years, the environment component is being taught in high school, and this increasing awareness will definitely have an implications in terms of the relationship between the human and the environment. So, as a result of this, we need to, in a sense, try to locate
historically how we humans have started trying to extract, if not exploit, the resources more abundantly, and then what are the factors responsible for it. So, unless we know the factors responsible for it, we can't afford to come up with some kind of a solution, or rather an alternative approach to this. Let us now try to look at how urbanization is in a sense affecting and disrupting the ecosystem. Now, as we all know, in the so-called traditional society, people are engaging in much more farming practices in rural areas, and today there is a shift of these farming practices which was more abundantly practiced in rural areas to cities. These are something which are the result of urbanization, and mostly also because of the increase in industrialization, and many of these industries are being centered in close proximity or within the city. Now, that sort of connectivity tends to help in terms of supplying the raw materials in a much more faster pace. Now, as a result of this, it has led to the destruction of this farmland and deforestation. And this, when we talk about this farmland, we are talking about in the rural context. Now, this destruction of this farmland and deforestation have resulted in the decrease of not just the amount of spaces for other species, but also in terms of the loss of habitats. Now, for instance, since we populate and then move towards the cities, we tend to pose a threat to the spaces, and there is an increasing loss of the habitats, and also we have this witness the decrease in the biodiversity. Now, when we talk about biodiversity, it includes not just the land, but also the water bodies. Like for instance, some of the floods which we have encountered and witnessed in the past few years, like for instance the flood in Chennai. If you looked at the kind of study which are being done, some of the possible factors was an unplanned way of human settlement, and also by developing those wetland areas into human settlement. Now, perhaps maybe there was a least concern and less awareness about the importance of these wetland areas, and you could actually see the water flowing in the heart of the city. These are in essence to be considered as a human or man-made disaster, which in essence we are alone responsible, and these floods could have been avoided if there has been a mechanism or a kind of plant which could have been easily avoided. Now, there could be certain other factors, but this is one basic and examples which we have generally encounter and witness in the context of this urbanization and this development of these cities exponentially have in a sense resulted in terms of the way this relationship between human and biodiversity, or the impact on biodiversity, is pretty much higher in compared to the past few decades. Now, all this in a sense has led to the disruption of the ecosystem by not just introducing new species to an area known or without known to the predator. Now, we in a sense human becomes sort of a predator rather than the protector. Now, that sort of unmindful activities which we usually engage tends to have a threat, and it disrupts the whole ecosystem. Now, continue to the increasing number of this industry and the establishment of agriculture mostly concentrated in the near the cities has in a way led to a terrible situation that human life seems to be posing a threat, and ecologically it has sort of to be seen as something we have reached a mark of a point of danger. Now, as a result of this increasing high level of industry and the agriculture which is concentrated mostly on human economic activities, have not just only posed a threat to the ecology, for instance, the pollution of environment, that is water pollution, air pollution and land pollution. Now, if you look at the agriculture concentration and human economic activities, now these human economic activities also, as I explained, mostly the agriculture which was practiced in the past is to do with the subsistence farming, but the agriculture practices today is more of the cash crop farming, and as a result of this, in order to have an enormous or high amount of production, people tends to use certain kind of maybe fertilizers, chemicals, so on and so forth. And as a result of this, ecologically speaking, it has posed a lot of threat. Now, and which eventually has led to the pollution of the environment, and in return these have a far-reaching impact on the human health. Now, therefore, a new branch of ecological science begins to develop with, and that is human ecology. That is because there are different branches of ecological science, and within this human ecology is one of them. Now, by saying so, we can in a sense say that human ecology is a discipline within the academia that deals with the association between humans and their natural environment. It is not just an associations between humans and humans, or maybe between humans and animals, but the whole natural environment, that is the ecosystem. Therefore, the kind of relationship which we shared with the natural environment, the humans share with the environment, is important, and this perhaps is one of the main pursuit of human ecology. And now, further explaining about what human ecology aspire and then endeavors to look at, it also attempts to investigate how individuals and maybe individual societies tends to sort of form a relationship with their environment. That is, it can be in terms of the economic activity, it can be in terms of the socio-culture and religious practices, and it can be varied. Now, definitely economic activity is perhaps the starting point, and one should also tend to look beyond this. It is not just the economic production which defined the human relationship, the environment per se, but also different other parameters into which we should have to situate the human environment discourse. Now, in the human ecology, it also attempts to integrate knowledge from old disciplines and the human experience, and also through these experiences it tries to improve the human relationship between in social and the natural communities. Now, because this, by trying to look at the experiences, we tends to like come up with a different suggestions and approach altogether, so that it tends to sort of form an alternative approach or a viable options. For instance, if we give an example of the traditional ecological knowledge of a particular community, say an indigenous community. Now, through their experience over the past generations, we tend to document and locate how influential and how beneficial these knowledge systems of those indigenous peoples, and perhaps by integrating this indigenous knowledge with the scientific knowledge, we can form an alternative approach or find a way out to solve this so-called ecological crisis which we are into. Now, that could be one way of looking at, because now in this indigenous knowledge again, or traditional ecological knowledge, is primarily based on the trial and error experiences of humans in their natural setting. Now, these experiences in a sense can be either improved or implemented, so that there can be a way out in this present context, wherein the idea or this sustainability is pretty much talked about and debated, or maybe sustainable development. Now, if you look at human ecology, also tends to look at the way human communities and human populations are not to be seen in isolation, but also they are part and parcel of the ecosystem. They are one the interrelated parts of the earth. Now, it is the special ecology of this species which is called the Homo sapiens. Now, the humans are also part of this whole ecosystem, and which is to be known as Homo sapiens. Now, human ecology was established in the field of sociology or sociological field in the 1920s, although this very basic discipline was being used by mainly who practice geography or in the field of geography. I mean, the geographers were the pioneer in terms of using this concept. Now, in recent times, the human ecology development is in essence mostly focused towards the decision of environmental management, making use of the nature in a more rational manner. When we talk about rational, we are not simply making sense of the resources, but we tend to weigh between the pros and cons, and ultimately if it only benefits the humans, we tend to engage in that. That is more or less a choice which is being made rationally, and this in essence has led to a diverse understanding of anthropological system. That is, anthropologists usually looked at the human culture and human society, and the way human society operates in the environment is something the ecological anthropologists tends to look at, and which perhaps I'll be discussing more in detail in the upcoming lectures, how the ecological anthropology operates. Now, secondly, human ecology also attempts to explore not only the influence of humans on their immediate environment, but also it tends to look at the influence of the environment on human behavior. So, as I said, the human culture is also being to a certain extent being influenced by the environment which human are into. Now, the food habits, the kind of dress, or maybe the kind of socio-religious practices which human have is being in a sense influenced by the environment system, and through this the human comes up with an adaptive strategies or adaptive mechanisms in order to manage or make sense or adjust with these influences in a much more better way. Now, if you take an examples of the riparian communities who are mostly inhabiting the bank of the river, that is the riparian communities, they are quite prone to encountering these floods. So, they might have a different cultural or adaptive mechanism to encounter these floods, maybe in terms of their food habits, or maybe in terms of their economic activities, agriculture practices, and maybe for instance the way they build their houses. There is a particular community in the Assam which is called the Missing tribe. They have these houses called Changar, and they have built a house which is elevated from the ground maybe 4 to 5 feet higher, and which in essence is used as a coping strategy in terms of staying aloof from the water which is normally during the flood. And also they have in essence a different kind of a warning system which they tend to understand or perceive about the impending floods through the signs of maybe the behavior of the animals and then the sounds of birds and animals. Now, these are something which a cultural community tends to develop across a time span and generations, and through this they are able to cope with any kind of disaster in a much more better way, so that the kind of impact or maybe the loss in terms of maybe human lives can be lessened and if not be avoided. Now, if you look across different cultural communities, they might have some kind of all these adaptive strategies to encounter or understand their environment in a much more better way. Now, this perhaps in a way is a way of thinking about the world, or maybe let us say the cosmology of any community, that is the worldview, how they perceive and how they try to situate and make sense and understand their relationship with the environment. Now, this perhaps is in a way how they tends to like perceive the world around them, and a context in which they in a sense defined themselves. So, within this we have to define our questions and ways to answer those questions. Why perhaps this particular community behave this way, and why is that they are following this kind of food habits or attires, the dress code. So, it has to be understood in the context. We cannot afford to read out of the context. It has to be read and understood or interpret in that particular context. Why people behave so, why they perceive so, why they think so. Now, I would like to recall Weber's understanding of Verstehen, which is a German term which he talks about interpretative understanding in sociology, wherein human needs to make sense or understand of other cultural groups by seeing into the subjectivity of the person who practice. Now, for instance, an accent to an outsider, what I do, what I act, the way I behave might not really make sense, a complete sense to someone who belong to a different cultural group. Now, within my own cultural group, what I do, the way I speak, my gesture, the way I make a facial expression, it makes sense to my immediate, if not within my cultural group, is simply because you have that kind of shared understanding and the kind of societal values, norms, ethics are something which we have learned, and these are in a sense a learned behavior. Now, by saying so, that subjective meaning which that embedded meanings which is attached to that particular accent should be understood in that particular context. Now, if an outsider should or attempts to make sense of a particular things, he should tends to interpret things from the taking the position of that particular person or community which he or she is looking into or studying. Only then that intrinsic or that embedded meaning which is attributed to that action could be meaningfully interpreted. This is what Weber has talked about in verse 10, that is interpretative understanding of interpretative understanding of human actions and the kind of meanings it attaches to it. Well, moving on, what human ecology attempts to look at, how does it tends to operationalize, or how it attempts to investigate the sort of the environment. Now, on the right hand side is a picture which was taken by me way back in the 2016 May. This is a place called Juko Valley, which is on the border of Manipur and Nagaland state, and this valley is a tourist destination, and it is the panoramic view and the picturesque view of this valley is so fascinating to the people around. And then there's this visitor which is like across different parts of the country, and then even we have come across foreigners visiting. And usually this enchanted valley, there's a lily which is called Juko lily, which in a sense blooms in the month of May to June. Now, the reason why I am portraying this picture is, apart from this scenic beauty, with the increase of tourists developing into moving into this area, in the last summer when I visited, I have come across unwanted throwing of waste item by those people who are engaged in the cooking, and then certain other sort of picnics and all. Now, it in essence pose a threat to the biodiversity of that particular place. And also we have come across in the vicinity of this area where there was the forest was set ablaze by fire, and then you can actually, I don't have a picture with me now, we have come across the forest which was being set fire by the region being unknown, but with the kind of precautionary measures taken by the the volunteers of that area, it was evident that might be because of the irresponsible, lighting, the use of light by the visitors, maybe using of the matchstick and so on and so forth. Now, the reason why I am highlighting this issue is because these are some examples of how the humans leave a far-reaching implications on the footprints which we have, in essence, has a far-reaching impact on the environment or the biodiversity. Now, maybe who knows, like in the coming 5 years, 10 years, this whole area might be full of waste, and then not so attractive like it is now. So, there has to be an increasing awareness in terms of how we engage in the environment in a much more responsible way, because unless we are aware about the kind of footprint which we are causing on the environment, it is nowhere going to be a lasting solution. Now, this very idea, I'm just trying to bring in this sort of a flow chart wherein you can see how things are being interconnected, and within the environment, how the human and nature, in a sense, shared sort of a symbiotic, if not, and a very interconnected relationship. Now, there can be in a natural setting, or in the there can be a sort of a change through the anthropogenic conditions, and this itself, the social or the humans are in a way being responsible, and by engaging into this, the human culture tends to pose a threat not just to the natural, and eventually it has, in a sense, a repercussion to the human. Now, if you look at the different sub-disciplines of ecological sciences, and of which human ecology is also one of them, and within the bioecologicals, you have this human ecology, animal ecology, and so on and so forth. And for you to have a rough idea of how human ecology emerges out of these ecological sciences, which is more or less theoretical, and then it endeavors to come up with certain kind of and lasting sort of an answer, because it begins with posing equations. Now, in real settings, human feels the influence of different environmental factors, and this perhaps are some of the things which we need to look at, how these components are interrelated within the environmental factors, and we will continue discussing of this in the next lecture.